Well, it's time to open a box, and this one could well contain a very interesting project. It comes from a gentleman in Denison, Texas. Apparently he rescued a Princeton Reverb chassis from a fire and wants to put it back into a cabinet and turn it back into a nice, fully functional Princeton Reverb. That's my understanding, at least. So let's open the box and see what we've got. Now, how about this for a first-class packing job? A layer of plywood to protect the contents here from being crushed, and then several layers of high-density foam over the amplifier, which looks fantastic. Nice silver face Princeton. Let's get it out of the box and see what we got. Alright, we've got the amp up here on the workbench. Let's take a look at what we have to work with. It appears that the fire damaged chassis has received a brand new silver face faceplate and knobs, and then it's been fit into a 68 silver face with the aluminum trimmed grill cloth cabinet. Okay, so far so good. It looks really nice. There is a tiny little blemish right here in the grill cloth, but otherwise this thing could pretty well pass for new. Looks like probably a good used handle, and then new metal trim strips here have been provided. The Tolex is good on the cabinet, but it shows some wear, so obviously it's a used cabinet from 1968, but gently used. Let's turn it around and see what we can figure out from the rear view. Alright, I removed that rear panel, and we can see that the fire damage to the rear panel on the chassis is fairly significant, and only a portion of that sort of a cover plate has been preserved. The chassis itself looks pretty shiny and nice underneath. Okay, if any of you have or know where you can buy a replacement rear control panel for a Silverface Fender Princeton Reverb, please let me know, because it would be a really nice touch on this amp. Looking downstairs, we see a Jensen 10-inch speaker, strangely devoid of any perimeter markings, but it looks like a suitable speaker for this amp. And on the bottom we have a brand new 4AB3 C1B Accutronics reverb tank. Okay, there are no cables that I can see, but it does have the 3-wire power cord, and it has a replacement can cap already installed. The output transformer seems a little loose. We have the reverb driver transformer, and I see no tube shields for the 12AX7s and 12AT7. We got a whole slew of tubes with it. Hopefully we can come up with one good set from all of these tubes. It's obvious that this chassis has been worked on. As I mentioned earlier, the can cap's been replaced, and these are brand new toggle switches. So some work has been done inside. I've unplugged the speaker. Let's unscrew the chassis, drop it down, and take a look and see what's been done and what needs to be done. Alright, let's pull those 4 chassis retention screws and drop this jewel down, slide it out, and see what we got. We can see from the serial number that this amp chassis was created in early 1969. Alright, looking down here at the top of the chassis, we see that all of the tube sockets have been replaced. The reverb driver transformer is fairly new. What would that be? Probably the 40th week of 2015. I'm not sure what the EIA code indicates. 989 is a rather high number, and I don't have that on my list. So this is new. As far as the power transformer, it and the output transformer were both made by Schumacher, which is appropriate. And it appears that the part number is correct. So this could be an original power transformer. I would say the same about the output transformer, except I see a 905 here. Now, maybe that's 69 the fifth week, but I tend to doubt it since the chassis was built in 1969. That would have been cutting it pretty close. But it is the correct number, so it's hard to tell. It might be an original, it's just been cleaned up. And of course, here is that replaced CAN capacitor. Now let's flip this over and take a look at what wiring changes have been made. Well, it would appear that the wiring changes are substantial. Virtually, what would you say, 75–80% of all the components have been replaced. Even the bias supply. Looks like the new tube sockets have all been wired in. Okay, let me make an observation now. The reason I always get excited when these things are pristine and untouched is that I could trust the wiring because the amp worked at one time. Now once they've been extensively rewired like this, all bets are off. I pretty much am going to have to go in and check every single connection in the circuit and every component to make sure that it's correct. Okay, and that's a whole lot more work. But it looks like the parts used are of a reasonably good quality. I think one thing that might be good is to stick in some tubes, plug it in and see what happens, and go from there. Okay, we're plugged into the new and improved current limiter. Speaker is connected, and I'm going to turn this on. I checked the original emails from the owner, and apparently he had this worked on by some technician in his area, and it was working for a while, and then it quit. Okay, so that gives us something to go on. Let's turn it on and see what happens now. Alright, the tubes are illuminated. I'm getting a power hum from the speaker, but even with the volume turned up, it responds to the volume except no amplification. When I ground the input, you know, it should hum loudly, and it doesn't. Okay, let's give it bass and treble just to be sure. There's nothing. Okay, so just with that simple test, it looks like the output tubes are probably functioning fine. I'll need to check the voltages, but the problem is going to be down here probably in the preamp section. And to narrow it down even more, I changed from channel 1 to channel 2. Channel 2 seems to be working. So we need to look here with the channel 1 input. There is a problem. And I am also smelling some heat here, so we'd best check into the biasing of the output tubes too while we're at it. Well, I made the huge mistake of touching the output tubes to see if they were hot. And after a quick trip to the emergency room for skin grafts, I can tell you, yes, they're hot. And look at this. This is kind of spooky. Look how the plate connection, the tip of the wire protrudes out here and touches over to the filament connection. That can't be good, and they are in contact. Okay, that's just terrible. Let me clip that little toenail off there. Here's another discovery. Look at this. It looks like a short between the two input jacks here. I tell you this, not to just strictly be critical, but when you are wiring an amp, it's very easy to bend the contacts away from each other, so you've got a little air gap there, and you can eliminate some short circuits. Well, the whole problem with channel 1 not working has been explained by that inadvertent short I just showed you, and it wasn't inadvertent. The shield here from channel 2 was actually hardwired to the signal output from channel 1. So all the signal from 1, it says, do I want to go to the 7025 or do I want to go to ground? Well, guess where it went. So now that that gap has been opened there and that wire has been removed, I think our channel 1 now will be able to produce some sound. Unfortunately though, the bias is at about 900 watts from what my finger will attest from touching the V6s. But let's look at the plate current here just for the heck of it in these output tubes. Here's the resistance of the half winding of the output transformer to the left 6V6 and to the right 6V6. You see they're very close. Now let's see what kind of voltage drop we get across these resistances. Okay, we've got a voltage drop around 16.8 volts. Let's calculate the plate current. Well, I think we have a winner in the highest plate current I've ever seen on a 6V6. How about 109.5 milliamps, whereas normal is what, 25 to 30? Okay, you can see why the tubes were red plating and roasting my fingertip. Okay, let's check the bias supply and see what's going on with it. Okay, now look, you just go sit down somewhere so you don't faint. Let me show you something here. This is pin 5 of the left-hand 6V6. That's the grid. Do you see any bias supply or signal input to the grid? I don't. Do you know what happens to a 6V6 when you don't have any negative bias on the grid? Well, let's see. I'm thinking 109.5 milliamps. Okay, now for the first time in recorded history, there actually is a wire running from the output here to the grid of the left-hand 6V6. Let's hook on a clip and check to see if there's about a minus 34 volts DC grid bias being applied to this tube pin. Well, it's still rather low. It's minus 28 and minus 34 is about right. Let's check the bias again now with some negative DC being applied to the grid. Well, a little better than negative 16.8 volts, minus 5.2. Let's see what kind of plate current we're looking at. What a difference a wire makes. Now the plate current on the left 6V6 is 33.9 milliamps. On the right is 27.1 times the plate voltage of 346.3, and we've got plate dissipation on the left of 11.7, on the right of 9.4. Not a great match, but it's a whole lot better than it was before. Okay, so that missing wire really made a difference. Our plate dissipation was simply too high on our 6V6s. As I recall, is around an average of 10 watts. So I increased the resistance from 22K up to 30K here in the bias circuit. You notice I didn't have a 30K resistor, so I did two 15s in series. And now let's see what our final tube bias is. Okay, here's the final tube bias with the 30K resistor in the bias circuit. As you can see, the plate dissipation is 8.9 and 7.9, which averages out to a perfect 8.4 watts. Now, some of you will say, well, that's not a very good match, but I'm going to say something now that's sort of a blasphemy probably to accepted thinking, and that is, with guitar amps, I don't think that perfectly matched output tubes are necessarily a good thing. Okay, in hi-fi circuits, yes, you want to minimize your distortion and hum completely. But in a guitar circuit, first off, a mild mismatch like this, or even if this were 6.9, you won't get really noticeable hum, and you're going to get a whole lot more complex harmonic spectrum output with mismatched output tubes than you will if they're perfectly matched. Okay, now I know I'll probably get some disagreement in the comments, but this is something that I kind of picked up just by listening and experience. I know it's counterintuitive from what we're all told, but trust me on this, try it yourself. Set up an amp with mismatched output tubes and see what you think. To me, it actually, in many cases, sounds better. We'll take a gander at the box that the Postal Service dropped off here, sent by Second Day Air. All kinds of fragile markings and electronic equipment, which really pique my interest. Let's get out the old razor blade and see what's inside. How about this for a beautiful packing job? All sorts of foam protecting the contents. This gem was sent by Jack Allen in Oklahoma, and I can tell you in advance, Jack, I think I'm going to really appreciate it. Let's dig down through all the foam and see what's inside. Well, this looks like quite the surprise package. A bunch of miscellaneous small items. New-tone lighted push button. Looks like a doorbell from the old days. Look at the price, $1.69. Looks like one of those old L-pad type of intercom or Muzak volume controls. A couple stereo headphone junction boxes. And now this is nice, an old-fashioned reverb tank, which I believe is going to go with the larger object that's buried in here. So let's get this out so we can excavate down and see what the main contents of this box are. Well, I guess Jack realized that I have a weak spot in my heart for Alamo amps because they're made in Texas. And look here, this is a Futura Reverb. Okay, some of the components have been borrowed, it looks like, but they're very basic ones, input jacks and toggles. Look at that chassis. It appears to me that this has a transistorized preamp, so it's a hybrid circuit with a tube output section here, which was typical of Alamo in the latter half of their period of existence. You can see the output tubes here, probably a phase inverter, and good stout transformers. This looks to me like it's going to be the basis for one heck of a neat project, Jack, and for that reason I want to thank you, and I know the viewers want to thank you for your generosity in sending it to me. I envision maybe even designing like a tube preamp over here to feed the tube output section down here. But time will tell. We'll see. Meanwhile, though, thanks again. I feel compelled really to start checking every component, and one of the first ones I checked is this resistor is supposed to be 18K, but as you can see, it's not, so I'm going to replace it. So now we have a proper 18K resistor here, 2-watt metal film. I measured this one and it is 1K, so that's correct. Now I'm going to go down the line and check every component on the eyelet board to make sure that it is a proper value and connected in the proper place. Okay, I'm using the signal generator to put out a 200 cycle per second tone into the formerly dead input 1, and we see that we can hear it just fine. Tone controls have some effect. Let's check the reverb. I've got cables connecting it to the tank, and of course it's stone dead. Okay, now let's try the tremolo. Oh, it was already on and I sure don't hear it. So tremolo's dead, reverb's dead, but now channel 1 and 2 are generating decent amplified tones. And the amp itself is nice and quiet now that I've found a way to ground the channel 2 input jack when it's not in use. The self-grounding feature had never been connected on it. Okay, I pulled out the reverb tank to see if it had any of the packing still in it, and it doesn't. It's loose and ready to work, and I'm putting grommets in each of the screw holes. Going to add 2 back here so that you have some rubber cushion between the tank and the cabinet. Well, the grommets are in place, and it's time to screw the tank back to the floor of the cabinet. Loosely, I don't usually tighten the screws down real tight, but keep it where the tank can kind of wiggle around a little bit. Also, a point to be made is that you see this jack here on the tank is labeled output. Now, common sense would say that the output from the tank would go to the input of the amp, and the output of the amp would go to the input of the tank. But just forget all that, because no common sense rules here. The way it's done is output to output, input to input. Okay, counterintuitive, but that's the way it is. Well, the tremolo's just giving me fits, okay? I believe I have the reverb working, but I even changed all three of the capacitors, the 0.02 and 2.01, some of the wiring, resoldered the connections, but I found something that makes me a little nervous, and that is this. Look here, this is how a socket pin acts when it's really connected to the tube pin. Now look at these two here. Watch this. Look at that. It just flops around. That one and the one next to it. Like they're not connected to anything. So I'm going to have to turn this over and see if there's something wrong with these two socket pins. Now I know this is just way too easy and it'll have no effect whatsoever, but I tightened, using a little tiny screwdriver, each of those clips that grab a hold of the tube pins. So now I'm going to reinstall the tube, and I'm going to try, I've tried two different 12AX7s, I'll try a third one just for the heck of it. Okay, and we'll see what happens. Alright, two pins are in the grip of death now. There's really good contact. Turn up our tone, and let's crank up our intensity and speed. Nothing. Deader than a doornail. I think I may have found the problem here with the tremolo. If you look right here at the junction of the 1 meg resistor, the 0.1 cap and the 0.02 cap, the B plus is connected there. Now I'm going to show you the schematic in just a second, and you'll see that the B plus was supposed to be connected right there. Okay, let's take a look and see what you think. Okay, here's the junction of the 0.1, the 0.02, and the 1 meg resistor. I don't see any B plus connecting there, but look here at the end of the 220K resistor, there it is. I believe then that there is a serious wiring error here, and that this red wire should actually connect over here. I'm going to do that and we'll see what happens. It's either going to be great tremolo or a lot of smoke. Okay, as you can see, I have removed the B plus from this junction and moved it over here to the tail of the 220K resistor as it shows in the schematic. Okay, you're seeing it at the same time I'm seeing it. Signal generator is on. Crank up our tone. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And we have tremolo. With a nice intensity at 10. Speed. It's actually too fast. I might slow it down, and you know how that's done is we're going to increase one of the 0.01s to 0.02, and that'll slow it down. But listen to that sweet tremolo. What a relief. You know, situations like this make me think that when I'm giving estimates to people on amp overhauls, I think one of my questions should be, has it been worked on before by a, and I put it in quotes, technician? And if so, I'm going to double the... Okay, as I've explained in previous videos, by reducing the value of this resistor, I'll show you on the schematic which one, from 1 megohm to 500K, We have greatly increased the intensity of the tremolo. Now it's time to slow it down by changing this 0.01 microfarad cap to a 0.02. I'll now demonstrate the difference with it being 0.01 versus 0.02. Okay, here's the speed at 0.01. There's the speed at 0.02. Now when we go all the way up to 10, it's not fluttering. There's actual individual pulses. And at 5, it's a good usable level, and you can go real slow down at 1. The 1 megohm resistor that I'm reducing to 500K is this one that is exiting from the plate of the 12AX7 oscillator tube. In the circuit, it's right here, and it points right at that nut on the tremolo tube, which is the 4th one from the left. So now the tremolo's been optimized, where at a setting of 5, now it's as stout as it was at 10 before, and the speed is probably about half what it was. I can see that the 3-wire power cord wasn't wired correctly. The switch is in the hot wire, the fuse is in the return, which of course isn't a good idea. So I'm going to have to rewire all of this primary circuit. Alright, now the black hot wire passes through both the power switch and the fuse before it connects to the primary winding of the power transformer. The white return wire connects directly to the other primary transformer lead. I also see that there is no grounded center tap for the 6-volt filament windings. There might have been a center tap, but it looks like there's a wire that's been cut off short. So I'm going to create a virtual center tap for the filament circuit and try to reduce the hum. I'll also explain to you how it works. Okay, here's a before without the center tap for the filament winding. Listen to how the hum responds to the volume control and gets really nasty up here around 8. Okay, now let's listen to it after the virtual center tap has been added. Okay, I've installed the virtual center tap, the two 100 ohm resistors across the terminals of the pilot light, which is really the most convenient way to do it, and the other end goes directly to ground. Also, I added a shielded wire from the input jacks all the way back here to the grid of the 7025. Now, listen, barely audible power hum, and that really awful buzz is gone. Okay, now let's discuss how this virtual center tap works. As you may know, when you have a center tapped transformer winding, you create two separate half windings, and each one of them will produce a signal that is 180 degrees out of phase with the other winding. This is the way output transformers work. This is the way that the high voltage winding works, so that we can use full wave rectifiers on these two signals. And in this case, since we had no center tap for the filament winding, the output was in phase, both of them. Okay, so by creating this virtual center tap with the 100 ohm resistors, we've created opposite phases in the filament wires. Now when you wind them like this, the opposite phases neutralize the electromagnetic field that they can produce, and therefore eliminate the 60 cycle hum that you were hearing just a few minutes ago. Okay, I've been through every component, wire, connection, the reverb tank, the driving transformer, I've tested the tubes. I can find nothing wrong now with the reverb circuit, and yet it's extremely weak. At 10, it's like about a 1 setting. So then I started coming up here, tracing this wire up to see how it fed into the circuit. And of course there is nothing here between it and the grid. But to the left, I saw a 3.3 meg resistor. But look in here at the circuit. This is it right here. And it's 3.3K, not meg. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm grabbing at straws, but I'm going to put in the proper resistor here and see if it makes any difference. Okay, I replaced the 3.3K resistor with the 3.3 meg resistor as is specified in the schematic. It's in place, so I'm going to put this camera on a tripod. I'm going to turn this thing on and hook up a guitar and strum a few chords. And I swear to you, if this doesn't fix it, I'm going to take an axe to it, okay? And I'll just say it was damaged during shipment or something like that, okay? Next scene is going to be do or die for this amp. Okay, I have the amp plugged in, the guitar is plugged in. I'm going to turn it up to a volume of like 3. It's absolutely dead quiet now, and it was humming before. I know you probably noticed that. Dead quiet. Let's just do a couple chords to get a volume check. Okay, now with the axe in one hand and the guitar in the other, which sounds redundant, I'm going to turn the reverb up to 5. Here goes. Little bit of oscillation. Let's try 10. Sounds like we got reverb. The amp is spared. Let's take a few moments here to analyze why this resistor, which is actually before the reverb circuit enters into the regular amplifier circuit, why that value would make such a huge difference in the reverb. Now here's why this resistor is critical to the reverb circuit. It creates back pressure in the preamp circuit. Okay, it's without the resistor here, or with a 3.3K resistor, the current will flow straight through to the output tubes. But when you put the beaver dam right here, you force a bunch of the signal to come down here and go through the reverb circuit. Then the amount of it here is controlled, that is sent back up to mix with the dry signal. So what you want here is a resistor of sufficient value to force signal to come down here through the reverb circuit, but not so high resistance that it doesn't allow enough dry signal to come through to mix right at this point right here. In many ways, you could think of this resistor as a overall plate resistor for the entire preamp circuit, because it functions like a plate resistor in that it forces signal to take 2 separate paths, and it controls the amount of signal that takes each path. Thus, with the properly chosen value for this resistor, you have a certain amount of dry signal arriving at this point, and you force a certain amount of wet signal, which is moderated down here by the reverb intensity pot, to arrive at the same point for mixing. I noticed in later versions of this circuit that a 2000 picofarad capacitor is placed between the tank input to the 12AX7 and ground. I believe that this is to cut down on the oscillations that tend to occur in reverb tanks. We heard a high frequency oscillation in that first test of the reverb. So I'm going to place a 2000 picofarad cap in this position on this circuit and see if we can't eliminate that oscillation. How it works is that, as you know, high frequencies can pass through low value capacitors. So if an oscillation is trying to set up here, instead of being able to come through here to the grid, the high frequency oscillation will take this shortcut to ground through that capacitor. And here is the 0.002 microfarad cap between the grid of the recovery triode of the 12AX7 and ground. Now let's strum a few chords and see how our reverb sounds. Okay, let's have a preliminary test here of all the controls and effects. This is with the volume at 4, and I'm using humbuckers. Treble and bass are at 5. Now let's try the tremolo at 5 and 5. Now the tremolo at 10 intensity, 5 speed. Now the reverb at 5. Now the reverb at 8. Reverb at 10. Now the combo platter, reverb at 5 and tremolo speed and intensity at 5. Okay, let's try some single coil pickups now at a higher volume. I'll crank it up to 7 with the treble and bass still at 5, reverb and tremolo off. Volume at 6, reverb at 5. Volume at 6, reverb at 5. Well, before we turn this over to Ollie and Jack for a couple of their tunes, let's discuss what's happened here. First off, the nightmare that will occur when you turn over an amp for extensive repairs by an incompetent person. It makes it much, much worse and about 10 times harder for the next guy to fix. On the plus side, however, an amp like this with incorrect value components and bad wiring it gives you all sorts of insights into proper repair practices and unusual things that might pop up from time to time that you'll have to fix yourself. I guess the bottom line here is you don't take your kids to some back alley pediatrician, and you shouldn't take your amps to some shady tech, okay, because you really don't get what you pay for. You're going to pay probably a fairly high price to get some really shabby work, and it's going to be a setback for you. You're paying, in other words, to be harmed, and that just doesn't make sense. So, without further ado, let's turn this Reborn circuitry here over to the tender mercies of Ollie and Jack for a few familiar tunes, and then we'll sign off. Also, I was pleased that that capacitor that I added right here into the reverb circuit did seem to eliminate that high frequency oscillation that we heard in one of the early tests. Well, I guess that's about it for this lurid saga of bad wiring, incorrect components, and seemingly insurmountable repair obstacles. I hope you were not overwhelmed by the drama and survived to share with me the joy of victory. I also wanted to express my appreciation to my PayPal contributors and my Patreon patrons, whose generosity has kept us on the air for another month advertising free. For those of you who would like to join them, check the links in the video description. Also, if you have any old amplifiers that you think might make interesting video subject matter, please contact me so we can discuss it. Meanwhile, thanks so much for your time and interest. Appreciate it, and hope you all stay healthy and stay tuned. Bye for